Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Carcanet book launch event. I'm really excited to be here. My name's Becky, and tonight we are obviously gathered here to launch Spillway, the new and selected poems of Ian Pople. We're going to be joined by Ian tonight and also by Canadian poet Evan Jones, who is also a Carcanet poet and has published 3 collections, the latest being Later Emperors in 2020. I'm going to hand over to Evan in just a minute. But first of all, there's just some general housekeeping stuff to run through, as always. So we're going to be together for about an hour tonight. So Ian's going to read, and then Ian and Evan are going to discuss the poems, have some general discussion. While Ian is reading, I'm going to be sharing the text on my screen. I'm going to be sharing my screen. You are in control of your screen, so if you want to make Ian bigger so you can lip read, you can just click on him and that will happen. If you've got any problems, please put them in the chat. That brings me on to the chat box. Please do find the chat box, because obviously this is a webinar and we can't see you, so we would love to hear from you. Like, tell us where you're from, how you're doing. There is also a Q&A box, which we would love you to be able to find. You'll be able to put some questions in there that Evan will then put to Ian in their discussion later on. I've posted the discount code in the chat as well. Thank you all so much for being here and paying your £2 to be here. All right, I think that's everything from me. I'm going to hand over to Evan, who's going to introduce Ian, and we can get the evening going. Thank you.
Good evening. I thought of a number of ways I could very humorously start off this event this evening. And I was thinking too, years ago, a friend of mine had someone write him a letter of reference, which began, so you decided to hire so-and-so. Dear God, I hope your job doesn't start before 10 a.m. and went on with a list of gripes about this particular person. And I couldn't do it, Ian, I tried. Instead I've got this. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Ian Pople, critic, teacher, traveler, moviegoer, music enthusiast, cricket fan, and a great many other things, at the center of which is poet, I'd argue, maker of an art of feeling, of friendships and admirations, of love and memory. His poems are meditations on the world around him, informed by his interests and his travels. But it's the minutiae that attract, the roots of a tree in a space where nature and the artificial meet. In Spillway, the collection's title poem, that curious in-between locale where the poet's gaze falls on a juxtaposition that often goes unnoticed. In The Quiet Limits, which I might argue is a kind of early poetics piece, the speaker tells us, I hold on to things more satisfactorily than you think. That satisfactorily I wrote to Ian when I'd had time to think about the poem, is something that comes to the fore in the artfulness of the poems, things held on to, in a style that Carol Rumens in a recent Guardian column called Ian's verbal delicacy and fine-tuning, and which are here collected and presented in the variousness and range of this new selected poems. The world, as Ian writes it, does not so much show its limitations as revel in the visible details of an individual life in a music that is realistic and tonally rich. The poems lead by example rather than rhetoric. People are played up and down, heroes come to the fore, jazz musician Roland Kirk, the theologian Karl Barth, the American poet William Matthews. And then there are travels, work abroad, Athens, Bangkok, Berlin, Sudan. Everywhere the poet notices not the everyday, but the unusual, the out of sight and the often undiscussed. It isn't the food or the beaches the speaker notices in the pied fantail, The Magnolia, where he tells us, the house opposite is porous with children's screams, the swoop and fall of intonation, and bird-like call, single, ricocheting stones across gravel. Spillway is a book that looks back to the recent past and points out things we might have missed along the way. What Ian finds is joy and humility, a deceptive simplicity, and an appreciation of the reality of the world of our lives. Please can I ask you to welcome Ian Pople.
Well, how on earth do I follow all of that? Well, just thank you. Because this is a launch and it's my first launch with Carcanet, there are a number of people I would very much like to thank, particularly Jazz and Becky for this evening and for the whole of the launch procedure as a whole. That's been wonderful. to Michael, clearly, to John, who has been my friend, mentor, guide for many years and has been a meticulous editor of this book. Finally, I'd just like to thank Andrew Latimer. Never has the old adage, do not judge a book by its cover, been more earned, because this is a beautiful, beautiful object. So thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. My father lost the top 2 joints of his right index finger as a result of an industrial accident. The end of April, in memory of my father. Finally, at the end of April, when afternoon light was strong enough to show the yellow of dandelions, you might have stroked the leaves of wild garlic, the thin edges buckling. You might have touched the underside of butterbur, the soft hooks that live out of the light, or ferns, new curlicues growing among the grey. You might have felt the crisp feathers of the Canada goose on the canal, stroked the firm back, pushed down a little, expecting the sanguine body of the bird to bob back up like a child's toy on bathwater. Except that, towards the end, having lost the whorls, the finger end, the knuckle, the bone digit that gripped the pen, the stub that was his forefinger became too painful to write with, because these were fingers that had not escaped, that had formed together into a shape through which water and sand flowed with equal measure. The quiet limits is a phrase taken from Tennyson's Tithonus. The quiet limits. Lights swung from side to side, and mist settled over the window where light was calling on my skin. I walked out into the shadow of the church tower. I hold on to things more satisfactorily than you think. That moment when the car kicks tramrails and wrists give way. Then when you check the mirror, the hand patting hair is yours. As has been noted, I have traveled, well, rather, I worked abroad for a number of years in my 30s and 40s. And I did undergo a number of interviews during that period, but none like this one. Speaking terms. From a lift where the light emerges from above the mirror, and when the doors pull open, you always turn to the left. Over red-brown carpet, so worn in places the underfelt shows, and where, you know, years of cleaners have never hoovered deep enough into the angle between pile and wainscot. There is a smell of drying out and crumbling, and past a ply and plasterboard door that's always scuffed and worn around the handle. The man expecting you is sitting. You would have liked him to be shorter than you as he rises from his chair to greet you with receding hair and glasses, but instead he's taller and slightly stooping, with the bluest eyes you have seen since you met the playwright's nephew. And it's no good asking why you are here, because you see, there is a little crisis just around the corner in Lesotho or Belize, somewhere in this known and shrieking world. And it's no good saying that you were there only to teach, and that was years ago and with the British Council, because the thought of open sky, 5 floors above your head, and the bus ride through the evening crowded autumn streets won't help you breathe. As if the walking from a smoky staff room to another lift had been enough to rouse you for the act of teaching, but scuffling pupils running to the classroom and pushing past has just depressed you in unexpected ways. Perspective now is down through wormless earth, almost to the molten core. And you would like to need to pull the collar from around your neck or fish your hanky out to wipe your brow, but it's not true. And all the time the face has gone on talking far, far more than you had had the right to hope. And the print of some small copse in somewhere English that's behind him on the wall has faded to its frame, and silence then sets in. Suddenly, a voice that's yours begins to talk you through the problems, and you're writing for yourself a memorandum of understanding. And there's the pulling back of chairs, the proffered hand. The hollow office door is closing shut behind you, and the dozen little marionettes that voice your life are clustering round you, asking for your help. Light falls from plastic boxes where dead moths have gathered, so you avoid the lift and take the concrete cold stairs up and cross the concrete foyer through swing doors into autumn light. A memorandum of understanding. Is that what I said? I hope that's what I said. This next piece is for my friend Pople in Dublin. I note you signed in, Charles, so I hope you're sitting with your laptop with something dark and yeasty in your left or right hand. There are a couple of mentions of streets in Ashton-under-Lyne for Charles Tyner. As men and women left the train and moved into the segments of their lives, I left that station for the first time, the evening newly darkened, and then walked streets I'd walked before, neon drifting pavements, Enville Street, Penny Meadow, and went to my appointment. I thought of your new intentions and how the rails spill on until they touch real presences, beyond sleepers and aggregates sopped with oil, scorched buddleia, brambles, the tunnel entrance and the hill's brow, and that angel caught in mid-utterance. I'm going to run through a number of texts from the later, newer poems, and I don't always have very much to say about these. Yes. In the last house that my mother lived in, she actually had a peach tree, but the peaches came down on top of her extension, on the flat roof of her extension. And so we could never get them before they were rotted and pulp. And also in her garden, she had a kumquat. Desert. I am walking away as into a desert. The trees on the left-hand side and the wall in the left-hand corner give me a sense of depth. I would rather the willow leaf fall was painted with dry brush scumbling to darken the colours towards the diagonal line as if to create some sense of shade. But on the other side of that line, I and my canvas are blank. I had wanted to open out the canvas and sit on the swaying striped resistance of its chair. I could then have blended in with my mother's garden, with the peaches darkening to pulp above me and kumquats trickling onto the soil. She might have had persimmons, but instead she had me, my insubstantiality dancing around her memory, the horizon crazed with swaying palm trees. The map chest. As I bent over the large top of the map chest to tidy folders, papers, plastic wallets, the window rose above me. Across the valley, green meadows fell. A church, half hidden, shouldered out onto the skyline, its curt brickwork pitted with windows like light bulbs, waiting for the filaments to burn out. And when the map chest was tidy and relocked, and when the church was spilled as if its flesh were sand, the rain came over the hill like water blown over the heel of my hand, the hand that was no good there and no good anywhere else. I spent 2 years living in Athens, and in one of the places I lived, my flat was in a block of flats owned by one of the ex-presidents of Greece. And because there were difficulties over post and I had to have a post box number, this good gentleman had to come downstairs with my post, which he wasn't best pleased about, and which I was remorselessly embarrassed about. Shelves. The woman strode out first, the man behind who pulled the luggage to take the airport bus through the suburbs on an Athens night. Lights on the balconies, lights in the trees, like two books with a common subject, whose authors' surnames begin with W, beside each other on the shelves. The former president who lived above and brought my letters down with increasingly bad grace, and her who never kissed me all that time. This is the title poem of the book, and as Evan mentioned in his introduction, it references the Swiss-German theologian Karl Barth, often considered to be the greatest theologian of the 20th century. Spillway. You went to lie down to examine the root of the tree, how it came from the earth, as if it were your tree, your earth. A stand of poplars waited at the field corner by the pond, the sky a kind of grease, and water ran over the spillway. Water turned on an edge and rounded most of the time in calm weather, like the hollow into which the axle fits, delimited by a ring of questions, Barth says, questions which will never cease. So you lay there, spilling and spinning. It didn't seem like a question. The body waited across the ground, the peculiar mirror of it, and what you saw in it, which looked at roots then glanced up at the slippery sky, at the crows sliding across it, perhaps between rookery and roost. Whenever I suppose myself near and see the lamb lie down away from the ewe, when the shadows spill into a darker stain, when I speak of such things, my breath clamoring beside the swart canal, its brickwork graffitied, the rows of gas canisters with their bulbous threat. Whenever I speak of these things, my breath is a honking skein with illusions of migration, like flatbeds pent up in the shunting yard, the piles of aggregate ready to slide, elder with its scruffy bloom. My father was an engineer surveyor before his retirement, and he worked for an insurance company called Eagle Star, and he used to drive around East Anglia in the little Morris Minor that the company provided, and his area ran from Kings Lynn to Great Yarmouth, Chelmsford. And in the evening he would come back and he would sign his forms of inspection in triplicate, usually with the phrase, worn but serviceable. And as I got a little older, he used to take me out in the car on my holidays, and I got used to the landscape of East Anglia as much as any rather self-absorbed 12 or 13-year-old boy could get used to the landscape of East Anglia. Rain. A lexicon of words that were not said in childhood, and all of those that were said beside an upturned boat, the lapped planking of the creosoted shed, were said into the wind on tussocky ground by farm rust vehicles, the buildings I could not complete without my father's help, the wind in which I was at sea, rain blooming in August that moved the land and overland towards the autumn, sliding through the gates of summer, feeling for the bone inside the wrist. And I'll finish with this. If I woke in the summer night, if I woke in the summer night and found myself like a collared dove descending onto the moonlit lawn, the stars perfectly placed around their chosen figures, artificially small perhaps, and mostly as though kneeling before that anonymous virgin and child, the face of the virgin bruised and unfinished, putty seemingly head and shoulders only, their wings close but only sketched in vague gestures, the virgin's drapery that ever-present Prussian blue, the undifferentiated air might still be gathering, the whole night round, a constellated blue, and to the small creature I found drifting past, I would say, bring me luck, little spider, on your flying thread. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Ian. Wonderful stuff. My goodness.
Thank you.
Yeah, bravo, bravo. People are saying in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. Most kind. Thank you.
Should we take a breath? Yes.
Yes, and possibly not very strong.
Sensible. Sensible.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
So I've taken off my friend introducer hat and I'm putting on my critic, questioner, interviewer hat for you. Are you ready?
Well, as I say, I was going to wear my flak jacket and steel helmet for the occasion. So, yeah.
Wonderful. So I will say, if you've got any questions at all, please put them into the Q&A box so I can respond to them here, because the chat goes so quickly I can't quite see if there's questions. So please do that. And Ian, why don't we start with something just sort of straightforward, I think, but why Spillway as a title poem? I think this is the one that you wanted to begin with.
Yeah. I had a previous title, and John, editing in his thorough good sense, rejected that title. Jim Johnson, as you know, in Toronto, had very kindly produced a beautiful pamphlet of which Spillway was the title. I suspect Spillway kind of works in a sense, perhaps the poems are a spillway, perhaps it's a kind of metaphor, perhaps there are kind of elements of water and fluidity which kind of wander through the book, and maybe, that sense of water and spillway works. How does one choose a title? This was a new and selected, and I was kind of very lucky to have that as a volume. I was very lucky that Michael and John wanted me to produce that kind of book. That was simply fantastic. And maybe in a sense, Spillway, which collects together something like 40 years writing, was kind of suitable.
Can I ask what the other title was?
The other
we won't tell, don't worry.
No. The other title was In Transit, which I thought kind of vaguely worked with, the kind of travel poems and some of the other stuff. But I mean, I think John, John knew better, and he was right.
Interesting. Because of course, there's so much of that transitioning even through all the poems in its way from place to place. Wonderful. So this brings me handily enough up to a question about your travel poems. So many of them, in fact, you seem to have written them since the very beginning, presenting the poet as a sort of tourist, though some of your poems make it clear that the speakers stay as longer term, certainly, than tourism. But these aren't about the usual alienation that we see in tourist poems, so much as the detail in other lives and other cities. Can you say a bit about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you feel that they contain details of other lives in other cities, then I would take that as a compliment. As I kind of mentioned elsewhere, I think travel poetry, and I mean, it's interesting that you use the word tourist. I wonder whether there's a kind of distinction between perhaps what we might see as tourist poetry and what we might see as travel poems, though I suspect there's more of a continuum than there is a kind of sense of either or. I've suggested that actually I think travel poetry is more about the self in transit, and the sense that one moves, that the self moves into other cultures, and yet the move into other cultures cannot escape the culture, the prism, the upbringing that one brings to that kind of looking, to that kind of gaze. I'm very much a product of my time, of my education, of my middle-class upbringing. And I think looking back on a number of those pieces now, I think that it's not that they're kind of wrong-headed. It's just that sometimes I think the perspective, the prism through which I saw those things was somewhat more fixed than I perhaps might have wished it. And if you feel that I have somehow successfully noticed things in other places, then I would take that. I would take that as a kind of compliment. I think it's a juggle. I think that it's not a question which is particularly satisfactorily resolved, not for me anyway. I think I'm blethering on here. I'm not quite sure whether I've answered your question or not, but
we'll take the blethering. It's good. I think you're right too that I mean, your poems are very much about the self, but you move into those spaces in those poems certainly, and the bit I was citing from the Pied Fantail, the Magnolia. I mean that's all about sort of the observations of this other place, certainly.
One hopes to approach these places with slightly a skin fewer than one brings into one's normal everyday existence. I mean, that's what I've hoped, and I've hoped that I've looked carefully and looked sensitively and looked in a way which respects. I don't know, perhaps one never knows.
I think there's a way to that, because I was thinking too, some of the tourist poems, the better, what I would call tourist poems, usually involve people sort of going to a foreign place and noticing things often that the locals have kind of, going to tourist spots that the locals would never go to, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And in a way sort of sometimes even sort of expanding on the notion of what that place might be then, because the tourist has a sort of unique vantage point, or the positive sort of side of tourism, certainly. And I think yours are quite different from that, though. I don't think you're not going to cities and sort of pulling out these kind of touristic destinations. You're much more looking at the details of these families, listening to families squabble in the apartment across the way and things like that. It's kind of fascinating.
Thank you.
Let me ask Ian, and I know this is probably the one you've been dreading the most, but I want to ask about your formal choices. And in particular, that 2-line verse paragraph, which is so prominent in your more recent poems. What is it about that form that works for you? And is there a connection? The length seems to range, as someone who went through and counted, between sort of 8-line poems and then 16-line poems, but there are a number of sort of 14-liners in there. And is the sonnet an influence in this, or is it?
I think it's interesting that you call them 2-line verse paragraphs and not couplets. And why?
I'm very careful is the answer to that, Ian.
Okay. I mean, the suggestion that they're 2-line verse paragraphs suggests that they have a unit of validity in and of themselves. And if you feel that, then again, I would take that as kind of compliment. There's part of me which wishes to stage the drift of ideas down the page. And the 2-liners seem to do that for me. I know that the texts can be relatively dense, and I think that if I presented them as a kind of slab of text, slab of writing, then it's conceivable that they might be a little more oppressive than they might necessarily have been. So I think that 2-liner, that drift down the page, that sense of a possible, I don't know, to be a bit pretentious about it, conceptual rhythm down the page. I mean, that is what I'm aiming for. The fact that some of them are 14-liners, I suspect is possibly a bit of a coincidence, Evan. The texts end up being the length that they end up, really. And if they so happen to be 14 lines, then kind of so be it, really.
I think those are reasonable answers, Ian. And along which lines, I believe, I'll just double check this here. Eve, forgive me, I can't see your last name anywhere, but someone called Eve has asked about your use of enjambment and how you decide or feel perhaps to end and start lines. Is there a sense you have where you know the line is going, or?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a simple feel for things. And occasionally I don't mind kind of going against my own feel for things. This is where it all gets a bit pretentious. A million years ago, when I did my MA with Michael, I wrote my dissertation on bunting and on the prosody of Brig Flats. Now, I read a paper on what was then called intonational prosody, which suggested that line endings occurred at clause and sentence boundaries, where there is a natural fall of the voice in kind of standard English, so that the lines would end at these kind of clausal and sentence boundaries. Now, whether that's kind of residual of that kind of investigation I did a million years ago, I'm not sure, but I think it's possibly in there in the back of my head. I mean, I do know that I kind of rove over endings from line endings from time to time. Again, I'm tempted to say kind of so be it. Yeah, I'm not sure I can do much better than that, really.
That's quite brilliant. I think there's a lot there to unpack and work with, certainly. One more from me, Ian, and it's actually a lot of the poems, as I was reading, there were a lot of poems that ended with sort of exits and entrances, and I thought I'd ask about that. Is there a sort of arrival or departure, even, as in for this relief, much thanks. The speaker tells us, behind me, my appointment, like this, the sort of the sense that some of the poems end in a very specific spot. Is that conscious, or is that something that you kind of happened upon?
The only review I've ever had in the TLS was Rory Waterman of my last book. And he said that he was very kind about the book, and he said that the poem seemed to end with a tight right ending. I don't know whether that's more luck than judgment. I suppose I have a feeling when the texts are coming into land. I think it's that. And if I've been lucky enough to kind of achieve an ending which feels sensible to you, to Rory Waterman, to others, then in a sense that's good. I mean, you talk about exits and entrances. Yeah, again, I'm not quite sure what to reply to that, really. I would like to think that the poem reaches a kind of resting place which allows it to wash back through the rest of the text. That would be a kind of an aim of mine, that there is a kind of washback, a bit like waves hitting the shore. Yeah.
That's beautifully and good. It's despite your hesitation, it's a beautiful answer. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you.
You ready for some non-Evan questions?
Fire away.
Yeah, good. Okay, so John Glenday writes, there's an almost willful use of repetition sometimes in your poetry, which I love. I'm thinking of poems such as Giverny. Can you say something about that?
I think repetition is a good thing, and people may not repeat enough. Clearly, too much repetition can be fairly stultifying and static, a bit like the needle getting caught in the groove. But if the text is intense, then perhaps repetition kind of frees that intensity, and also in a sense kind of emphasizing it. Again, I'm not being very articulate about this, but I think repetition is a useful thing. And it's not so I'm writing song lyrics where somebody has to burst into a chorus. But yeah, thank you, John, for that question.
And you're being highly articulate, in fact. Ruth Sharman asks, I'm interested by some of the very bold enjambments sometimes running across stanzas. Can you say anything about this? This will take us back to line breaks, but maybe enjambments more specifically. Ian, is that connected to those ideas you were talking about earlier?
Yes, thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I think it is. I'm sometimes a little suspicious, maybe, or I think that possibly when a line comes to emphatically to an end, that sometimes the fluency, the fluidity of what's going on, sometimes I would like to move through that. You know, I mean, I suppose the standard rule is you don't normally break a preposition from an article, or you wouldn't break an adjective from a noun. But just sometimes I think those kind of rules are there to be broken. And, you know, if you think about the shape and the drift of the poem down the page, then I'm willing to kind of, as part of that shape and drift, possibly to move through an enjambment. Yes.
Are you ever thematic with your enjambments, with your word endings, or is it just mostly about more about the rhythm?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your first word there.
Are you ever thematic with your kind of word endings, you think, or is it more about
thematic or thematic?
Thematic.
Thematic.
Yes.
I'm not quite sure that I'm with you. What do you mean by thematic?
I'm wondering if you're ending on words that might have a resonance with the rest of the poem, or
well, I suppose one hopes so. Yeah. I would need to kind of go back into the poems and kind of pick out ones where that might be true. What was it Auden said about Marianne Moore, that breaking across with the syllabic form through the emphasis onto the beginning of the line rather than having it at the end of the line. And maybe some of that works. Maybe some of that works.
I think that's brilliant too, God. I need to read more Marianne Moore. Whitney McVie asks, thinking about memory, I was wondering if you write in situ on your travels or whether you write about memory from notes, whether you write poems in the moment or later on reflection, or both.
Yes, I mean, I think I'd probably do all of those things. I mean, like most people, I carry a notebook. And if things, images, words, phrases flitter past my befuddled mind, then I immediately grab my little brown book and jot away in it. And then these things kind of accumulate. When it comes to the travel poems, I mean, sometimes, you know, it's emotion recollected in tranquility. And sometimes I think those texts are better than ones that are written more on the hoof. For me personally, I mean, you know, there are a lot of people who are able to do that kind of spontaneous writing. In the previous session with Peter Sansom, he was talking about the New York poets, Frank O'Hara getting back for his lunch and then sitting down at his desk and typing things out in his typewriter. I mean, I wish is my kind of response to that. I've got the typewriter, but it's always bundled away. So yeah, but all of those things, yes. I
remember Les Murray arriving in Manchester and reading in Disborough, I think, years and years ago, and saying he'd been writing poems on the plane on the way over. And I was like, how could you concentrate or be in this? I don't understand these things.
Yeah, no.
Adrian Buckner writes, there's a generous clutch of new poems in your selected. Do you feel they represent a new departure for you, and do they anticipate new ground for you to set out from?
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, they, and particularly because Evan has picked out the formal changes in those new poems, that a lot of them are the couplet. And it's something that I have stayed with, actually. I mean, I've written new stuff since, you know, this new book hit the printers, and the couplet has kind of stayed with me. So that formal thing has stayed with me. Whether, I would like to think that there are new departures, and I would like to think that if Carcanet or whomsoever were to produce another book for me, that new book would kind of smack of the new. But in a sense, that would be up to the reader. This old guy is maundering on, and you know, I'm producing vaguely what I'm producing, I suppose.
John McAuliffe of Manchester writes, could you talk a little bit about jazz and also about your writing lifelong love for poet and sometimes jazz pianist Roy Fisher?
Oh yes, Roy, yes. The great beloved Roy, to whose memory this book is dedicated. I mean, Roy, John was my PhD supervisor, and I wrote my PhD on Roy. I mean, Roy loved jazz of a period that I didn't really have a taste for. I mean, his was mostly of the music of the 30s and 40s, and he was a complete specialist on American pianists of that period. I mean, the title of one of his books was a thing about Joe Sullivan, and Sullivan was, I think, even more obscure, was certainly more obscure now than he was even then, and he was fairly obscure then. And Roy would pick up on a pianist like Richard Twadzick, and you know, he was a real expert on that kind of jazz. The jazz that I've loved over the years has been more of the kind of post-Coltrane period, and working through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and up until now. I love its freedoms. I love its disciplines. I love the fact that you have improvisers and yet you have collectivity. I simply love the fact that, you know, it comes from a place, the improvisatory impulse comes from a place which is both schooled and spontaneous. And I think there's often a richness to it that that I find transporting. Yeah. In order to, the answer to your question there, and I'm sorry I lost your name, the name was Richard Twadzick, T-Z-A-D-Z-I-K, T-W-A-D-Z-I-K, Richard Twadzick.
You're following another conversation, I see. Okay, gosh.
Sorry.
Remarkable. No, remarkable. That's amazing. God. Rachel Mann writes, can you say a little more, as we're jumping from jazz to theology so smoothly here, can you say a little bit more about use of art in the Spillway poem? A little bit of theological leakage into the lyric?
Yes, well, Rachel would know much, much more about this than I do. And she would probably know Barth's work a lot. Barth was the great prophet of Revelation. These are deep and mystical and theological Christian waters. I think that this sense that when one gazes, one possibly sees or tries to see or wants to see or is able to see beyond the object itself to something which may or may not be revelatory. This is all very tentative and it's all very difficult. But I think it's that sense that if one gazes with sufficient focus, then one might chance upon something beyond the gaze.
That's almost contradictory. I love it. Yeah, yeah. Remarkable. In which case, Ian, there's one more question.
Sure.
And again, from this John McAuliffe of Manchester. As a reviewer, some recent American poetry has been vital to your work. but is a very Catholic. But is a very Catholic range from William Matthews, Doug Crace, Carolyn Forshey, Carl Phillips. How does being a reviewer kind of play into your work as a poet and your writing?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one reads poetry in order to, I don't know, again, this is pretentious, it kind of adds to the sum total of one's existence. And one gets into it, one gets the poetry bug, perhaps, at a relatively early age. And then I've been able to write about this stuff and place reviews. And, I've been lucky in that I've, come across poets that have added to the sum total of my existence. Carl Phillips, Doug Crace, Ori Cole, Joanna Klink, Roy Fisher, your man Cavafy.
No.
What I've come to realize recently is I think these people are the adults in the room. And what they write about has a kind of maturity and a kind of searching empathy, which adds to one's own life. And teasing that out and being able to write about it, I've been very lucky in that I've had platforms to kind of flaunt the sound of my own pen. Yeah, how that feeds into my own writing, I'm not sure. And again, I might kind of say, well, I wish. But reading these people adds to one's life. Almost as simple as that.
Do you think Carl Phillips, because I remember when I first read Carl Phillips around The Tether, he used that kind of 2-line verse paragraph as well. Do you think that might have been an influence?
I mean, it's conceivable. I mean, to be perfectly frank with you, I don't know the earlier stuff as well as I should. Or recent stuff. Excuse me, I mean, he's used along the line and varying forms. And again, it is that huge fluency he has. Fluency in the line, fluency in the verse paragraph, fluency in the poem as a whole, fluency in the book, which, just makes the writing compelling.
Oh, that's lovely. Ian, I know that they're going to shut us down shortly, and I don't know if you've got anything prepared, but do you think you could read one more poem to kind of?
Yeah, you caught me on the there, and this won't come up on the screen because it's a late edition. But I just like I'd like to read a poem called The Tent Maker for my son, Ben. Ben and I went to the Sporades a couple of years ago, and we walked up the hill to the Evangelistrius Monastery, which is where independence from the Ottoman Empire was declared at the beginning of the 19th century. The Tent Maker. Evangelistrius Monastery, Skiathos, September 2018, to Ben. Paul, the apostle, the tent maker, when needing help, took it only where it seems he would not have to give in return. And so it was that we turned right past the petrol station, past the Port Authority building, and beyond it, where in the uncut verge, 3 turkeys, a parent and 2 youngsters freely grazed with that strange sound their family mystery makes, past the summer villas, a playground and a garden, its swings all chained, sheep crowded into smaller field, fed hay, by a man who walked in corduroys among them, and high on the hill, above both them and us, an unfinished, sharply pitched roof. Or this in the late afternoon, which was the time we'd chosen, still hot, and you lagged behind to watch the many cats, the way their casual lives are worked, and summer dusty dogs barking on chains behind dull fences. At the end of the climb was a stone-built monastery, its plants, succulents or lemon trees in olive oil cans, a man hosing them as some people waited for the service in the dark chapel with icon-crusted walls and close chairs where I bent to see the much-kissed Annunciation, while you, with your sweet confidence, asked the driver in English if, when the priest had finished, we could have a lift back down the hill. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ian, thank you so much for tonight. It's been really, really wonderful. And Evan as well, thank you for the questions. Really wonderful questions tonight, everybody. Thank you for sending those in. And congratulations, Ian. It's such a brilliant book, and that last poem was gorgeous as well. I'm going to leave the chat open for just a couple of minutes to let everybody get their congratulations in, and to give you a chance to read it, Ian. And yeah, just thank you both so much. We do have another launch coming up on July 13th, so quite a while away, and that's Caroline Bird's Rookie. So if you want to find out anything else about that, then all the details are on our website. Yeah, thank you both again for just a wonderful evening. And yeah, that's all from me.